Some things aren't meant to stay buried, no matter how deep you hide them. Sometimes the past finds you in the most unexpected places, wrapped in dust and silence, waiting for the right moment to speak. Agnes Roury has lived alone in the Idaho mountains for 20 years, asking nothing from anyone and keeping her history to herself. When a bitter neighbor offers her the contents of an old storage shed, calling it worthless trash, she accepts out of simple courtesy. But inside that crumbling building, beneath rotting quilts and forgotten belongings, Agnes discovers something that belonged to her family, something someone deliberately tried to erase. What secret was hidden from her all these years, and why? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Agnes Roury woke before dawn, as she had for the past 2 decades. The cabin was cold, the way she preferred it in October, and she could see her breath in the dim light that filtered through the curtains she'd sewn from old wool blankets. She lay still for a moment, listening to the forest wake around her, the rustling of pine branches in the wind, the distant call of a raven, the soft creak of timber settling in the cooling air. She rose without hurry and built a fire in the wood stove, her movements practiced and efficient. The kindling caught quickly, and soon the warmth began to spread through the single room that served as her kitchen, living area, and study. Her bedroom was a small loft accessible by a ladder she'd built herself, and her bathroom was an addition she'd constructed in her 3rd year here, complete with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower that drew from the spring uphill. Coffee was a ritual she refused to abandon, even in her chosen isolation. She ground the beans by hand, boiled water in a kettle on the stove, and poured it slowly through a cloth filter into her cup. The smell alone was worth the effort. She took her coffee to the porch and sat in the wooden chair she'd carved from a fallen cedar, watching the sky lighten over the ridgeline. This was northern Idaho at its finest, dense stands of Douglas fir and western larch, steep canyons carved by ancient glaciers, and silence so complete it felt like a presence of its own. Agnes had built her cabin on 20 acres she'd purchased with her divorce settlement, land so remote that the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away through rough terrain. The road, if you could call it that, was barely navigable even in good weather, and completely impassable from November through April. She'd chosen this isolation deliberately. 20 years ago, when her marriage ended after 15 years of slow dissolution, she'd known she needed distance from the life she'd built in Boise. The suburbs, the office job, the social obligations, the constant noise, all of it had felt like a costume she'd been wearing for too long. Her ex-husband had called her crazy when she told him she was moving to the mountains. Maybe she was, but it was the kind of crazy that had saved her life. Agnes finished her coffee and went back inside to dress for the day. Layers were essential: a thermal shirt, a wool sweater her grandmother had knitted 50 years ago, canvas work pants, and boots she'd resoled twice. She strapped a knife to her belt, not for protection but for utility, and slung her rifle over her shoulder. Not because she expected trouble, but because the forest demanded respect and preparation. Her morning walk took her along a loop she'd established over the years, a 5-mile circuit that let her check the game trails, inspect her few snares, and simply move through the landscape she'd come to know as intimately as her own body. She could read weather in the behavior of birds, track deer by the pressure of their hooves in soft earth, and identify every plant that grew in these elevations. Today the air smelled of coming rain, though the sky was still clear. The aspens were turning gold, their leaves trembling in the slight breeze, and the undergrowth was thick with huckleberry bushes, already stripped bare by bears preparing for winter. She found fresh elk sign near the creek and made a mental note. They were moving down from the high country earlier than usual this year. Hard winter ahead, probably. She returned to the cabin by mid-morning and spent the afternoon on maintenance work. The roof needed attention before the snow came, and she climbed up with her tools to replace several shingles that had blown loose in last week's windstorm. From up there, she could see for miles, ridge after ridge of unbroken forest. No houses, no roads, no sign of human presence except the thin line of smoke rising from her own chimney. It was exactly what she'd wanted, what she'd needed. And yet, lately, she'd felt something shifting inside herself. Not loneliness exactly, she'd made peace with solitude long ago. More like a quiet restlessness, a sense that some chapter was ending and another waiting to begin. Though she couldn't have said what that meant or why she felt it, she thought about her family sometimes, though not as often as she once had. Her parents were gone now, her father to a heart attack 12 years back, and her mother to cancer just 3 years later. She'd made the trip down the mountain for both funerals, sat quietly in the back of the church, and returned to her cabin without staying for the receptions. Her sister lived in Seattle, and they exchanged Christmas cards, nothing more. Her cousin Dennis had moved to Oregon and called once a year, usually around her birthday, conversations that were friendly but brief. The Roury name had once meant something in these valleys. Her grandfather had owned a lumber operation, modest but successful, and her grandmother had been active in community affairs, serving on school boards and library committees. But that was another era, another world. By the time Agnes was born, the family business had been sold, and the Rourys had faded into the background of local history. She climbed down from the roof as the afternoon light began to slant long and golden through the trees. Inside, she lit the lamps and made herself dinner. Venison stew from meat she'd processed last fall, vegetables from her small garden, bread she'd baked 3 days ago. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, then washed her dishes and settled into her chair by the fire with a book, but she couldn't concentrate on the words. Her mind kept drifting to a ledger she'd found while organizing her shelves last week, an old accounting book that had belonged to her grandfather, filled with entries from the 1960s and early 1970s. She'd flipped through it idly, recognizing some of the names, puzzling over the transactions, lumber sales, equipment purchases, payroll for employees she dimly remembered as weathered men in flannel shirts who'd come to her grandparents' house for coffee and her grandmother's pie. One entry had caught her attention. A large payment to E. Clegg in 1973, noted simply as settlement. The amount was substantial, enough to make her wonder what it had been for. The Cleggs were another old family in the area, though Agnes knew them only by reputation, stubborn, reclusive, territorial about their land and privacy. She'd seen Amos Clegg around town over the years, a man about her own age who always looked like he'd just swallowed something bitter. She set the book aside and stared into the fire. Family history had never particularly interested her, especially not after she'd left her old life behind. But something about that entry nagged at her, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was just the restlessness talking, her mind looking for puzzles to solve in the absence of other complications. The fire burned low, and she banked it for the night, climbed the ladder to her loft, and lay down in the darkness. Sleep came slowly, as it often did, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of her grandmother, a woman she'd loved deeply as a child, but understood only partially. In the dream, her grandmother was standing at a window, looking out at land Agnes didn't recognize, and there were tears on her weathered face. Agnes woke in the middle of the night, unsettled, and couldn't get back to sleep. She climbed down from the loft and stood at her own window, looking out at the forest, silhouetted against the stars. The restlessness was stronger now, almost physical, like something pulling at her chest. She didn't believe in omens or premonitions, but she'd learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that something was about to change. Something was coming, though she had no idea what or from where. In the morning, she would go to the general store for supplies. It was a trip she made once every 2 weeks, a concession to the practicalities of her chosen life. Coffee, flour, salt, ammunition, lamp oil, the things she couldn't produce or harvest herself. She tried to time these visits for early weekday mornings when the store was quietest, when she could slip in and out with minimal interaction. But tomorrow, she would learn, would be different. Tomorrow, Amos Clegg would be there, and he would make her an offer that would unravel 20 years of careful solitude and lead her straight into the heart of a story she never knew belonged to her. For now, though she stood at the window and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, a woman alone in the wilderness, keeper of her own peace, guardian of her own silence. The forest held its secrets, and she held hers, and that balance had been enough until now. The general store sat at a crossroads where the paved county highway met a network of dirt logging roads. It was an old building, wood-sided and practical, with a covered porch where locals gathered to talk when the weather was decent. Agnes pulled her truck into the gravel parking lot at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning, early enough that she hoped to avoid the usual crowd. Inside, the store smelled of coffee and old wood and the faint mustiness of a building that had stood in the same spot for 80 years. Gideon Marsh stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper through thick glasses. He was 70 if he was a day, had owned the store for as long as Agnes had been coming here, and had the good sense to let her shop in peace without forcing conversation. "Morning, Agnes," he said, barely looking up. "Morning, Gideon." She took a basket and moved through the narrow aisles, collecting what she needed. The store carried a little of everything: basic groceries, hardware supplies, work clothes, ammunition, propane canisters. It was the kind of place that existed to serve people who lived far from anywhere else, who couldn't run to a supermarket on a whim. She was examining bags of coffee beans when the door opened and Amos Clegg walked in. Agnes knew him on sight, though they'd rarely spoken. He was maybe 60, tall and lean, with the kind of wiriness that came from hard physical work. His face was weathered, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, and he wore the permanent scowl of a man who'd decided long ago that the world was fundamentally disappointing. His clothes were work-worn: canvas jacket, denim shirt, boots that had seen better decades. He nodded once in her direction, a bare acknowledgement, and moved toward the counter where Gideon was setting out fresh coffee in paper cups. Agnes went back to her shopping, hoping that would be the extent of their interaction. But Amos didn't leave after getting his coffee. He stood by the counter, shifting his weight from foot to foot, glancing in her direction every few seconds like a man working up to something. Agnes pretended not to notice. She'd learned long ago that the best way to discourage unwanted attention was to simply not provide any openings for it. When she brought her basket to the counter, Amos was still there. Gideon rang up her purchases with methodical slowness, while Amos cleared his throat twice, drank some coffee, and finally spoke. "You're Agnes Roury." It wasn't a question. She looked at him directly for the first time. His eyes were pale blue, red-rimmed, uncomfortable. "I am. Your grandmother was Helen Roury, Helen Prescott, before she married." Agnes set down the bag of flour she'd been holding. "That's right. She knew my family. Long time back. I expect she knew most families around here. Long time back." Amos's jaw worked like he was chewing something tough. "I got a thing up at the old trapline property. Storage shed my grandfather built. It's falling apart. Needs to be cleared out before winter or it'll cave in completely." Agnes waited. She had no idea where this was going. "There's stuff in there," Amos continued, still not quite meeting her eyes. "Old boxes, furniture, who knows what all. Been sitting there 40, 50 years. My grandfather told me—" He stopped, started again. "He said if I ever had to clear it out, I should offer it to a Roury first. Said your family had a right to look through it." Agnes frowned. "Why would my family have any right to your grandfather's belongings?" "I don't know. He never explained. But he was specific about it." Amos drained his coffee cup and crushed it in his fist. "Take it if you want. It's trash. I don't want to see it anymore. I just need it gone." The bitterness in his voice was almost palpable. Agnes studied him, trying to understand what was really being offered here. "Where is this shed?" "Up past the old Patterson Creek Bridge, then about 3 miles on the logging road." "You know where the Clegg trapline starts?" She did. It was rough country, steep and remote even by local standards. "I know it. Shed's about a half-mile up the trail from where the road ends. Don't miss it. It's the only structure out there." He pulled a key from his pocket and set it on the counter. "Lock's probably rusted through, but that's the key if you need it. Do what you want with the contents. Burn it, dump it, keep it. I don't care. Just get it out of there." He turned and walked out before Agnes could respond, the door banging shut behind him. She stood there, holding the key, completely baffled by the entire encounter. Gideon finished ringing up her purchases. That was strange, even for Amos. "You know anything about this?" "Nope, but the Cleggs and your grandparents had some kind of falling out back in the 70s. Nobody talks about it much anymore. Most folks who remember are dead or don't want to remember." He bagged her supplies. "You going to go look?" Agnes pocketed the key. "I suppose I am, if only to satisfy my curiosity." 2 days later she made the drive. The logging road was as rough as she remembered, barely more than 2 ruts through the undergrowth, and her truck rattled over exposed rocks and through deep potholes filled with muddy water from recent rain. When the road became impassable even for her 4-wheel drive, she parked and continued on foot. The trail was overgrown but still visible, marked by old blazes cut into tree trunks decades ago. She walked steadily uphill, rifle slung over her shoulder more from habit than necessity, breathing easy despite the elevation gain. The forest here was darker, the canopy thick overhead, and the silence had a weighted quality to it. The shed appeared suddenly, tucked into a small clearing where the land flattened briefly before climbing again. It was exactly as Amos had described, a small structure maybe 12 feet by 12. Built from rough-cut lumber that had weathered to gray. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Agnes approached carefully, testing the ground with each step. The whole building looked ready to collapse, and she had no interest in being inside when it did. The lock was indeed rusted through, and the key wasn't necessary. She pulled the door open. It scraped loudly across the dirt floor and looked inside. The shed was packed nearly to the ceiling with debris. Old wooden chairs with broken legs, cardboard boxes swollen with moisture and mildew, rolled up canvas that might have been tents or tarps, picture frames with shattered glass, and piles of unidentifiable fabric that could have been clothing or curtains or bedding. Everything smelled of rot and mouse droppings and abandonment. Agnes stood in the doorway, wondering what her grandmother could possibly have to do with this accumulation of junk. Then something caught her eye, a glint of metal between 2 boxes. She stepped carefully inside, testing each floorboard before putting her weight on it, and reached for the object. It was a key ring, old brass with 3 keys attached. They were wedged between floorboards, partially hidden, as if they'd been dropped and forgotten or deliberately concealed. Agnes worked them free and held them up to the light filtering through gaps in the roof. Each key was labeled with initials in faded ink. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, and suddenly shockingly familiar. Agnes had seen that handwriting before in birthday cards and letters her grandmother had sent when Agnes was a child. She would have recognized it anywhere. Her grandmother had labeled these keys, which meant her grandmother had been here, in this shed, at some point, had hidden or lost these keys among Amos's family belongings. Agnes turned the key ring over in her palm, her heart beating faster. The initials on the keys meant nothing to her now, but they had clearly meant something to her grandmother. Enough to label them carefully. Enough to bring them here. She looked back at the shed full of forgotten things and felt that restlessness surge into something sharper. This wasn't random junk. This was a story, and her grandmother had been part of it. She pocketed the keys and began to pull boxes into the clearing, working methodically despite the growing chill in the air. By the time the light began to fail, she'd sorted through maybe a quarter of the shed's contents and found nothing else of obvious significance. But she marked everything she wanted to take back for closer examination. Several boxes, a few of the less damaged picture frames, some bundled papers that might be readable once they dried. She would need to make multiple trips, and she would need to look at everything carefully, systematically, because Amos's grandfather hadn't asked him to offer this to Roury out of simple generosity. He'd done it because there was something here that connected their families, something that had been buried deliberately, something her grandmother had been involved with. Agnes walked back to her truck in the gathering darkness, the key ring heavy in her pocket. Her carefully maintained solitude suddenly felt less like a choice and more like a pause before something inevitable. The past had found her, and she was going to find out why. Agnes made 4 trips to the shed over the next week, hauling back boxes and frames and bundles of papers in the bed of her truck. She worked carefully, methodically, the way she approached everything in her life. Each item was catalogued mentally, sorted into categories, laid out on her cabin floor for examination. Most of it was exactly what Amos had called it: trash. Rotted clothing that fell apart when touched, campaign signs for politicians dead 30 years, old tools so rusted they were beyond salvage. But mixed in with the obvious debris were things that shouldn't have been there, things that felt personal and precious despite their deteriorated condition. She found the photograph on her 5th day of sorting. It was in a frame with cracked glass, tucked between 2 boxes of mildewed quilts that smelled so strongly of decay she'd almost thrown them out unexamined. The frame itself was water-damaged, the wood swollen and splitting, but the photograph inside had been partially protected. Agnes carefully removed the glass and lifted out the picture. It showed 6 people standing in front of a wooden fence post, the kind used to mark property boundaries. The photograph was black and white, faded to sepia, probably from the late 1940s or early 1950s, based on the clothing and the style of the print. She recognized her grandmother immediately, the straight posture, the direct gaze into the camera, the strong features that had softened but never quite disappeared even in old age. She looked young in the photograph, maybe 30, standing confidently with her hands on her hips. Next to her was another woman about the same age, similar in build and coloring, close enough that they might have been sisters. But what stopped Agnes cold was the face that had been deliberately scratched out. Someone had taken a sharp object, a knife or nail, and scored the emulsion deeply, obliterating one person's features completely. The violence of the act was obvious even 50 years later. Agnes studied the other faces, trying to place them. 2 men who had the weathered look of outdoor workers. Another woman, older, stern-faced, and a young boy, maybe 10 or 12, standing slightly apart from the group. She thought one of the men might be Amos's grandfather, though she'd only seen him a handful of times as a child and couldn't be certain. But who had been scratched out, and why? The deliberate erasure felt malicious, intended not just to remove someone from a photograph, but to negate their very existence in that moment, that place. She turned the frame over. On the back, barely legible, was a notation in pencil: Boundary Agreement, September 1951. Nothing more. But it confirmed this was about land, about property, about families negotiating something important enough to document. Agnes set the photograph aside and continued through the boxes, working late into the night by lamplight. She found more photographs, most less damaged, showing the same group of people at different times. Her grandmother appeared in several, always standing near the other woman. In one, they had their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling. In another, they were sitting on the porch of a house Agnes didn't recognize, drinking from tin cups. Friends, clearly. Close friends. The kind of friendship that shows in body language and unguarded expressions. Agnes tried to remember if her grandmother had ever mentioned this woman. There had been talk of old friends, certainly. Vague references to people from the past, but no one specific stood out in Agnes's childhood memories. Her grandmother had been a private person in some ways, keeping parts of her history close. The next morning, Agnes drove back down to the general store. Gideon was sweeping the porch when she arrived. "You find anything interesting in that shed?" he asked. "Maybe. Can I show you something?" She brought out the photograph with the scratched face and the one showing the 2 women on the porch. Gideon took them to the light, squinting through his glasses. "That's your grandmother, sure enough. And that's Hazel Clegg next to her." "Amos's aunt, Hazel Clegg," Agnes repeated. The name meant nothing to her. Were they friends? More than friends, from what I heard. They grew up together, were inseparable as young women. People called them the twins, even though they weren't related. Gideon handed back the photographs. Hazel died young, mid-50s, I think. Maybe earlier. Before my time running this store, but the old-timers used to mention her now and then. What happened to her? Gideon's expression grew uncomfortable. I don't rightly know. There was talk. There's always talk in small towns. But nothing I'd want to repeat as fact. Something sad, I gather. Your grandmother took it hard, from what I understand. And the families. The Cleggs and the Rourys. You said they had a falling out. That came later, in the 70s. I was around for that. Property disputes, settlement money, lawyers involved. Your grandfather sold some land to the Cleggs, but there was argument about the terms. Got bitter. Families stopped speaking. Agnes thought about the ledger entry she'd found, settlement to E. Clegg in 1973, 20 years after the photograph. Do you know what the dispute was about? No one really talked about the details. Just that it got ugly, and everyone wished it had been handled different. Gideon paused. Why are you digging into this, Agnes? Ancient history. Most folks involved are dead, because someone went to a lot of trouble to hide these things. And my grandmother labeled those keys I found. She was involved somehow, and I'd like to know how. Gideon shook his head slowly. Sometimes old business is better left alone. Whatever happened, it's been buried a long time. Digging it up might not bring anything good. Agnes thanked him and left, but his warning only strengthened her resolve. She'd spent 20 years letting go of her past, building a life of deliberate disconnection. But this wasn't her past. It was her grandmother's, and her grandmother had clearly cared deeply about whatever had happened. That afternoon, Agnes made a decision. She would go to the county seat, a full day's drive south, and look at the property records. If there had been a legal dispute, there would be documentation. She would find the sale records, the settlement papers, whatever had been filed publicly. It took her 2 days to prepare for the trip, securing her cabin, arranging her supplies, planning the route. She left at dawn on a Tuesday and drove south through the mountains, watching the landscape change as elevation decreased. By noon she was in the valley, passing through small towns that felt almost unbearably crowded after her isolation. The county courthouse was a brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. Inside, a tired-looking clerk directed her to the records office, where another clerk, younger but equally bored, showed her how to access the property. Files. Agnes requested all records for the Roury and Clegg properties from 1950 to 1980. The clerk returned with 3 thick folders and pointed her to a table where she could review them. It took hours to go through everything. Most of it was routine, property taxes, boundary surveys, maintenance filings. But then she found the sale records from 1973. Her grandfather, James Roury, selling 40 acres to Edgar Clegg for a sum that seemed surprisingly low, even accounting for inflation. The accompanying documents showed the land had been assessed at nearly twice what Edgar paid. There was a notation about a mutually agreed settlement and another reference to a separate agreement filed privately. Agnes flipped forward and found more. A lawsuit filed in 1972 by Helen Roury, her grandmother, against the Clegg family. The details were minimal, just a case number and a notation that it had been settled out of court. The specifics of what Helen had been suing for were not included in the public record, but it confirmed what Gideon had said. There had been legal action. Her grandmother had initiated it, and it had been resolved with property transfer and money changing hands. Agnes requested copies of everything and paid the fee. As she waited for them to be made, she stared at her grandmother's signature on the lawsuit filing. The handwriting was the same as on those key labels. Strong, decisive, angry in its very firmness. What had happened? What had made her grandmother angry enough to sue? And how did Hazel Clegg, who died in the 50s, connect to a lawsuit filed 20 years later? Agnes drove back toward the mountains as evening fell, her mind turning over possibilities. The more she learned, the less she understood. But she was certain now that this wasn't about property alone. This was about something personal, something that had fractured a friendship and divided families. And somewhere in that storage shed, or in those keys her grandmother had labeled, was the rest of the story. Agnes returned to the shed with renewed purpose. Now that she knew there was a deliberate story hidden here, she approached each box with greater care, looking not just for obvious artifacts, but for things concealed or protected. She found the letters on a cold morning when frost silvered the grass and her breath clouded in the air. They were in a metal box, about the size of a shoebox. Tucked beneath several layers of rotting quilts in a corner of the shed she'd initially dismissed as too damaged to contain anything valuable. The box was rusty but intact, with a simple clasp that opened easily. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from the worst of the moisture, was a bundle of letters tied with twine. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the ink was still legible. Agnes carried the box outside and sat on a fallen log to read. Her hands were shaking slightly as she untied the twine, not from cold, but from the sense that she was about to cross a threshold. To learn something that had been kept secret for decades. The first letter was dated March 1973 and was addressed to Mrs. Helen Roury from a law firm in Boise. It was formal, cautious in its language, but Agnes could read the meaning beneath the legal phrasing. Her grandmother had consulted them about pursuing action regarding the matter we discussed. The lawyer advised proceeding carefully, noting that the parties involved have considerable influence and that public revelation could have consequences beyond the immediate legal concerns. The next letter was her grandmother's reply, written in the same strong hand Agnes had seen on the key labels and the lawsuit filing. Her grandmother's voice came through clearly, despite the formal language. Anger, determination, frustration at being counseled toward caution. "I understand your concerns," she wrote, "but remaining silent accomplishes nothing. Hazel deserved better. Her daughter deserves better. If the only way to force acknowledgement is through legal action, then that is what I will do." Agnes read the sentence 3 times. Hazel's daughter. Hazel Clegg had had a daughter, and apparently something about that daughter was worth fighting over, worth a lawsuit, worth breaking family relationships. The correspondence continued through 1973 and into 1974. Her grandmother had filed the lawsuit, as Agnes had discovered at the courthouse. The letters showed an escalating battle, motions filed, depositions scheduled, threats of counterclaims. The Clegg family had hired their own attorneys, expensive ones from Spokane, and were fighting hard. But there were other letters mixed in, not from lawyers. These were written to her grandmother from someone who signed simply as H. The handwriting was shaky, emotional, harder to read. "Helen, please stop," one said. "I know you mean well, but this will only make everything worse." "She doesn't know and she shouldn't know. Let her have the life she has. It's better than the alternative." Another, "The guilt is mine to carry, not yours. You were always the strong one." But strength isn't always the answer. Sometimes mercy is stronger. Agnes pieced together the story slowly, reading and rereading the letters, cross-referencing dates and references. Hazel had gotten pregnant, unmarried, probably in the early 1950s. There had been a child, a daughter, who had been given up or taken away. Her grandmother had known about it, had been involved somehow, had witnessed what happened. 20 years later, something had prompted her grandmother to take action, to try to force recognition or compensation or acknowledgement. The lawsuit had been her grandmother's way of fighting for Hazel, or for Hazel's daughter, long after Hazel herself was gone. But the letters from H suggested Hazel hadn't wanted the fight, or at least someone, possibly Hazel herself, if she'd still been alive in the 70s, was asking Helen to stop. Agnes looked through the remaining letters. There was one final exchange with the lawyer, dated December 1974. "In light of the settlement offer," the lawyer wrote, "I recommend acceptance. You have accomplished what can be accomplished under the circumstances. Further action risks losing everything gained." Her grandmother's reply was brief, bitter. "I accept the terms, but this is not justice. This is silence purchased. I hope the cost weighs on their consciences, as it will on mine." The final item in the box was a handwritten note, undated, in her grandmother's hand. It appeared to be a draft or a copy of something she'd written to someone else. "To whoever finds these letters, if anyone does, know that I tried. I tried to make them acknowledge what they did. I tried to force the truth into the open. I failed. The powerful protect their own, and the rest of us learn to live with injustice. But I could not destroy these documents. Someone should know. Someone should remember. Hazel was my dearest friend. What they did to her was cruel. What they denied her daughter was crueler still. I pray that someday someone will have the courage I lacked to bring the full truth to light. Agnes sat with the letters in her lap as the morning warmed around her. Her grandmother had carried this burden for decades. The friendship with Hazel, whatever tragedy had befallen her, the child who had been lost or given away, the battle to force acknowledgement, the final settlement that had felt like defeat, and now that burden had passed to Agnes, whether she wanted it or not. Amos's grandfather had made sure of that by instructing Amos to offer the shed's contents to a Roury. He'd known these letters were here. He'd known Agnes, or someone from her family, would eventually find them. She needed to know more. She needed to find out what happened to Hazel's daughter, whether she was still alive, whether she knew anything about her origins. The lawsuit and settlement had happened 50 years ago. If the daughter had been born in the early 50s, she would be in her 70s now. Agnes took out her phone, stared at it for a long moment, then pulled up her contact list. She hadn't called her cousin Dennis in over a year, but he was the only family member she still had any relationship with, however minimal. He answered on the fourth ring. "Agnes, that you?" "It's me. I need to ask you about grandmother Helen." There was a pause. "What about her? Did she ever mention someone named Hazel Clegg, or talk about a lawsuit against the Clegg family?" The silence stretched so long, Agnes thought the call had dropped. Then Dennis said quietly, "You found something." "I found letters." "About Hazel's daughter? About a lawsuit in the 70s? Jesus, Agnes, where did you find them?" "The Cleggs had them." "In an old storage shed. They gave me the contents to sort through." Dennis let out a long breath. "I was hoping those were lost, burned, something. You knew about this?" "Grandmother told me, made me promise never to talk about it. Same with my brother. She told us right before she died, said we should know the family history, but we should never repeat it. Never dig it up. Let it stay buried." Agnes felt anger rising. "So everyone just agreed to forget? To pretend it never happened?" "It was 50 years ago, Agnes. Everyone involved made their peace with it. What good does it do to drag it all up now? What happened to Hazel's daughter?" Dennis hesitated. "I don't know all the details. Grandmother said she was adopted by a wealthy family. Had a good life. Never knew she was adopted, or at least not who her real mother was. Grandmother thought telling her would do more harm than good, but she filed a lawsuit." "Yeah, she did. She was angry, wanted to force acknowledgement, compensation maybe. But it got settled quietly. Money changed hands, property got transferred. Everyone signed agreements not to talk about it. And it's been quiet ever since." Agnes stood up, pacing. "So we just let it stay buried? Let Hazel be forgotten?" "Hazel's been dead for 70 years, Agnes, and her daughter, if she's even still alive, has had her whole life not knowing. Is it kind to tell her now? When she's old, when everyone who could explain or apologize is dead? That's not for us to decide. That's for her to decide. Maybe, or maybe grandmother was right. Maybe some truths cause more pain than healing." Dennis sighed. "Look, I don't want to tell you what to do, but think about it carefully before you go turning over rocks. What's underneath might be uglier than you expect." Agnes thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the clearing, surrounded by the sorted contents of the shed, holding the letters that her grandmother had written and received and ultimately hidden away. Dennis was right about one thing: this would be ugly. The truth always was. When it involved power and coercion and families, protecting their reputations at the expense of vulnerable people. But Agnes had spent 20 years in these mountains, learning to face difficult truths about herself and her own choices. She wasn't going to turn away from this one. Agnes spent the next 3 days going through the remaining boxes with meticulous care. She was looking for something specific now. Any clue to the identity of Hazel's daughter, any hint of where the child had gone, any connection to a family name. She found the locket on a grey afternoon when rain drummed steadily on the shed's failing roof. It was in a small wooden box tucked among children's clothing, tiny dresses and knitted sweaters that had been carefully folded and stored, as if someone had wanted to preserve them despite knowing they'd never be used again. The locket was tarnished silver, small and delicate, on a broken chain. Agnes opened it carefully and found a tiny photograph inside, the kind that used to be made in portrait studios in the 1940s and 50s. The woman in the photograph was young, maybe 20, with dark hair styled in the fashion of that era. She had a direct gaze and a slight smile, and something about her expression suggested both strength and sadness. Agnes turned the locket over. On the back, engraved in script so small she had to squint to read it, "For my daughter, who deserved better." A mother's message. Hazel's message, Agnes was certain. This was Hazel Clegg, young and hopeful and unaware of what was coming. And she'd intended this locket for her daughter, though apparently it had never been given. Agnes closed her fist around the locket and walked back to her truck through the rain. She drove straight to the general store, not caring that she was soaked and muddy, not caring that it was late afternoon and the place would be busy. Gideon was helping another customer when she walked in. She waited impatiently, the locket clutched in her hand, until he was free. When he came over, she set it on the counter. "Tell me about Hazel Clegg." Gideon picked up the locket, opened it, and his face changed. The usual weathered neutrality gave way to something softer, sadder. "Where did you get this?" "The shed." "Tell me about her." He was quiet for a long moment, then gestured to the small office behind the counter. "Come on back. This isn't a conversation for the floor." In the office, surrounded by filing cabinets and boxes of inventory, Gideon sat heavily in his chair and turned the locket over in his hands. "Hazel Clegg was before my time, but everyone who was here in the 50s knew the story, or thought they did." "What story?" "She was a good woman, well-liked. Friends with your grandmother. They were inseparable when they were young. Then Hazel got pregnant. No husband, no engagement, nothing. Was 1951, maybe early 52. Different times, Agnes. A woman in that situation had limited options, and most of them were bad." Agnes sat on a stack of boxes. "What happened?" "She had the baby. A girl. For about 2 weeks, Hazel kept her, tried to figure out how to manage. But her family was mortified, respectable people, they thought, and now this scandal. And there was a family in the valley, the Pritchards, who couldn't have children. They wanted to adopt. They were wealthy, connected, and they made it happen fast. They took her baby. The Cleggs gave permission. Hazel didn't want to, from what I heard. She fought it. But she was young, unmarried, had no legal standing. The Pritchards filed for adoption, and it went through. Hazel got to keep her daughter for 2 weeks, and then she was gone. Agnes felt sick. And Hazel? She was never right after that. Not mentally ill, like some said, but broken in spirit. She died young. She was maybe 25, 26. Officially, it was complications from an illness, but there was talk of suicide. Or at the very least, she just gave up on living. And her daughter? The Pritchards raised her as their own. Named her Lillian. She had a good life, far as I know. The Pritchards loved her, gave her everything. She married, had kids of her own, grandkids by now. She runs the historical society down in the valley. Nice woman, Agnes's pulse quickened. Lillian Pritchard. A real name, a living person, someone she could find. Does she know she was adopted? That I can't say for certain. The Pritchards might have told her, might not have. Either way, I'd be surprised if she knows who her birth mother was. The Cleggs and Pritchards agreed to keep that quiet, to protect the Cleggs from embarrassment, and to protect Lillian from knowing her mother died heartbroken after losing her. Lots of folks thought it was merciful, letting her believe she'd been given up freely rather than ripped away. Gideon handed back the locket. Is that mercy? I don't know. But I do know that's what your grandmother thought she was fighting for in the 70s. She wanted the Pritchards to acknowledge what they'd done, wanted compensation for the Clegg family, wanted something on the record. And she lost. She settled. Maybe that's the same thing. He looked at Agnes directly. You're thinking about telling Lillian, aren't you? She has a right to know who her mother was. Maybe, or maybe she has a right to the peace she's built without knowing. Those are different things, Agnes. And once you tell her, you can't untell her. You'll be changing her history, her sense of who she is, at a point in life when most folks want stability, not upheaval. Agnes left the store with the locket and drove home through continuing rain. Back in her cabin, she lit the lamps and sat at her table, the locket open in front of her. Hazel's young face looked up at her, frozen in time, frozen in hope for a daughter she would lose and die grieving. She thought about her own grandmother, carrying this story for decades, fighting for justice and settling for silence, hiding these artifacts away but unable to destroy them, torn between truth and mercy. Agnes had always admired her grandmother's strength. Now she saw the cost of that strength, the burden of knowing, the weight of deciding, the lonely responsibility of being keeper of other people's pain. She made a decision. She would find Lillian Pritchard, but she wouldn't approach her immediately. First, she would learn everything she could about Lillian's life. Where she lived, what kind of person she was, whether she seemed content or curious, whether she'd ever searched for her origins. Agnes would watch and assess, and only then would she decide if revealing the truth was an act of justice or cruelty. It took 2 days to find Lillian's contact information. She lived in the valley town where Agnes had visited the courthouse about 3 hours south. Agnes found a phone number, an address, and several references to her work with the Historical Society. She'd published articles about local history, given talks at schools, organized preservation efforts for old buildings. Agnes read everything she could find online, studying photographs of Lillian at various events. She was 73, a widow, mother of 3, grandmother of 7. She had Hazel's dark hair, now grey, and something of Hazel's direct gaze. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. In one photograph, Lillian stood in front of a house that looked oddly familiar. Agnes enlarged the image, studying the background. Then she pulled out the map she'd found in the shed, the one showing the original Roury family land holdings. The house Lillian lived in sat on property that had belonged to Agnes's grandfather. Property that had been sold to the Cleggs in 1973 as part of the settlement, then apparently sold again to the Pritchards. Hazel's daughter was living on land that should have been her mother's inheritance. The bitter irony of it made Agnes's chest tight. Had anyone involved in the settlement realized this? Or was it just another layer of cruelty, compounded by time and circumstance? Agnes picked up her phone and started to dial Lillian's number, then stopped. This couldn't be done over the phone. It needed to be face-to-face, needed to be handled with care and respect. She would drive down to the valley, would request a meeting under some pretext, would look Lillian in the eye and gauge whether she was the kind of person who wanted to know the truth about her origins. And then Agnes would decide. Honor her grandmother's silence or break it. Agnes composed an email to Lillian through the Historical Society's website, keeping it simple and honest, or at least partly honest. She explained that she was researching her own family history and had come across references to the Clegg and Pritchard families that she hoped to understand better. Would Lillian be willing to meet and discuss local history from that era? The reply came within 2 hours. Lillian would be delighted to help. She suggested meeting at her home the following Tuesday afternoon. She'd make coffee and dig out what materials she had from the Historical Society's archives. Agnes spent the intervening days preparing. She organized all the artifacts she'd found, made copies of the letters and legal documents, and practiced what she might say. But every rehearsal felt wrong, too blunt, too gentle, too presumptive. There was no good way to tell someone that their entire understanding of their origins was built on coercion and loss. She also made one more trip to the shed, searching for any remaining items she might have missed. In the very back corner, behind a collapsed shelf, she found one last box. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and water-stained, but still intact. Agnes carried it outside and sat in the weak autumn sunlight to read. The handwriting was her grandmother's, the entries spanning from 1950 to 1985. It was not a daily diary, but rather a record of significant events and reflections. Entries separated sometimes by months or years. The early entries detailed her grandmother's friendship with Hazel. They'd grown up together, attended the same school, worked together at the town library one summer. The warmth and affection came through clearly. Inside jokes, shared confidences. The kind of friendship that becomes a cornerstone of identity. Then came the entries from 1952. Brief, anguished notes about Hazel's pregnancy. The family's reaction, the pressure to give up the child. Her grandmother had tried to help, had offered to support Hazel, had argued with both families. But she'd been powerless against their combined determination. April 12th, 1952. They took the baby today. Hazel held her for 2 weeks, and now she's gone, given to people with money and influence and connections. Hazel is broken. I've never seen anyone so destroyed. She won't eat, won't speak. The Pritchards came with papers already signed by everyone but Hazel, and they got her signature somehow. Coerced it, I'm sure, but I can't prove it. I will never forgive them. I will never forgive myself for not doing more. The next entry was dated 6 months later. October 1952, Hazel is gone. The doctors say it was complications from pneumonia, but I know better. She died of a broken heart. She died because they took everything from her and left her nothing to live for. I wanted to stand up at her funeral and tell everyone the truth, but what good would it do? It won't bring her back. It won't give her daughter back. It will only make the Pritchards close ranks and the Cleggs more ashamed. For 20 years, there were no entries about Hazel or her daughter. Then in 1972, a new note, June 1972, I've been watching Lillian Pritchard. She's 20 years old now, just graduated from college. She looks so much like Hazel, the same profile, the same way of tilting her head when she listens. Does she know? Does she wonder? The Pritchards have given her everything Hazel couldn't. Education, travel, social connections. Should I be grateful for that? Should I let sleeping dogs lie? But I see Hazel's face every time I look at her, and my silence feels like betrayal. The entries that followed chronicled her grandmother's internal struggle. She'd consulted lawyers, filed the lawsuit, fought as hard as she could against families with far more resources. She documented everything, kept records, built a case, but the final entry, dated March 1985, revealed her ultimate decision. I'm 68 years old and I'm tired. The lawsuit settled years ago. Money and land changed hands. Everyone signed agreements to never discuss it. The Pritchards agreed to make some provision for the Clegg family, compensation of a sort, though it can never compensate for what was taken. And I agreed to silence. Lillian is in her 30s now, married with children of her own. She's built a good life on a foundation she believes is solid. Do I have the right to shatter that foundation? To tell her that her parents coerced a young woman into giving up her child? That her birth mother died grieving for her? What purpose would it serve except to transfer the pain from the dead to the living? Hazel is gone. I'm old. The Pritchards are old. Maybe mercy is letting this story die with us. But I can't destroy these documents. I can't erase Hazel completely, so I'm hiding them where they might someday be found. By someone who might be braver than I am, and I'm leaving it to fate or providence or chance. If Lillian is meant to know, she'll know. If not, perhaps that's the kinder outcome. Hazel, my dearest friend, forgive me. I tried. But I'm choosing mercy over justice, and I hope that's what you would have wanted. Agnes closed the journal and sat with it in her lap, tears running down her face. Her grandmother had carried this alone for 35 years, had fought and surrendered and lived with doubt about whether she'd made the right choice. And in the end, she'd left the decision to whoever came after her, too exhausted to bear it any longer. Now Agnes held that decision, and she still didn't know what the right answer was. She drove down to the valley on Tuesday morning, arriving 2 hours early. She spent the time driving through town, locating Lillian's house, studying the neighborhood. It was a quiet street of older homes, well maintained, with mature trees and tidy yards. The kind of place where people had lived for decades, where roots went deep. Lillian's house was white with blue trim, a front porch with hanging baskets of late-season flowers. There was a car in the driveway, a practical sedan, not new but cared for. Everything about the property suggested stability, contentment, a life well lived. Agnes parked down the street and waited. At 2:45, she walked up to the door and knocked. Footsteps inside, then the door opened. Lillian Pritchard stood there, smiling warmly. She was shorter than Agnes expected, maybe 5'4", with grey hair cut short and practical. She wore jeans and a cardigan, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. And yes, she had Hazel's eyes. Dark, direct, intelligent. "You must be Agnes. Come in, come in. I've got coffee ready, and I pulled some files that might interest you." Agnes followed her inside, to a living room filled with books and family photographs. The coffee table was already set with cups, cream, sugar, and a plate of homemade cookies. Everything warm and welcoming. "I have to say," Lillian said as she poured coffee, "I was intrigued by your email. Not many young people are interested in old family histories anymore. What specifically are you hoping to learn about?" Agnes accepted the coffee and tried to steady her hands. "My grandmother was Helen Roury, Helen Prescott before she married. Did you ever come across that name in your historical society work?" Lillian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Recognition, maybe. Or memory." "Helen Roury, yes, actually. She was involved in some property transactions in the 70s. There was also a lawsuit, civil matter, I think. It came up when we were documenting land ownership changes for the county's Centennial Project. Did you research it further?" "Not really. It seemed like a private family dispute. We tend to focus on more public historical events." Lillian studied Agnes over her coffee cup. "Why the interest in your grandmother's legal affairs?" This was the moment. Agnes could deflect, could ask general questions, could leave without revealing anything. Or she could take the plunge. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph, the one showing Helen and Hazel together, arms around each other, smiling. "Because I found this. And I think there's a story here that someone tried very hard to bury." Lillian took the photograph and went very still. She stared at it for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes had gone sharp and focused in a way that reminded Agnes strongly of both her grandmother and Hazel. "That's my mother," Lillian said quietly. "My adoptive mother. And the woman next to her, I don't know her, but I've seen that face before." "Where?" "In my mirror." The silence in the room stretched and deepened. Lillian set down her coffee cup with a hand that trembled slightly. She kept looking at the photograph, then at Agnes, then back to the photograph. "I need you to tell me everything," Lillian said finally. "And I need you to tell me the truth, not what you think I want to hear." Agnes had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, all her rehearsed speeches felt inadequate. She pulled out the other items she'd brought, the locket, copies of the letters, the journal entries, the legal documents. She laid them on the coffee table one by one. "The woman in the photograph is Hazel Clegg. She was your grandmother's best friend. And she was your birth mother," Lillian's breath caught. "My birth mother? Yes, I found these in a storage shed that had belonged to the Clegg family. They were deliberately hidden. And I think your grandmother, Helen Roury, my grandmother, was the one who hid them. She wanted the truth preserved, but she didn't want to cause you pain by revealing it." Agnes told the story as gently as she could, but there was no way to soften the essential facts. Hazel's pregnancy in 1951, the family's shame, the Pritchards' desire for a child, the adoption that had been rushed through with pressure and legal maneuvering, Hazel's heartbreak, her death. Lillian listened without interrupting, her face growing paler, but her composure holding. When Agnes finished, she picked up the locket and opened it. "This is her?" "Yes, she made that for you. The inscription says, 'For my daughter who deserved better.' She wanted you to have it, but I don't think it ever reached you." Lillian's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She studied the photograph in the locket with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "I found out I was adopted when I was 40. Found the papers after my mother, after the woman who raised me, died. It said my birth mother's name was listed as unknown. I looked for records, but there was nothing. I thought she must have been someone who didn't want me, someone who gave me up voluntarily. She wanted you. She fought to keep you. They took you anyway. They. Lillian's voice was flat. My parents. The people who raised me, who loved me, who gave me everything. They took me from a woman who wanted to keep me. I don't know all the details of what pressure they applied, but yes. The documents suggest the adoption happened very quickly and against Hazel's wishes. She had no legal standing as an unmarried mother. And your adoptive parents had connections that she didn't. Lillian stood and walked to the window, her back to Agnes. For a long moment she was silent, looking out at her tidy yard, her carefully maintained life. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled, but Agnes could hear the emotion beneath. I had a good life. My parents loved me. They gave me opportunities Hazel never could have. Education, travel, stability. I never doubted their love. I'm sure you didn't, but it was built on a lie. Built on someone else's grief. Lillian turned back. Did my grandmother know this? Did Helen know what my parents had done? She knew. She witnessed it. She tried to stop it and couldn't. And 20 years later, she tried to force acknowledgement through legal action. That's what the lawsuit was about. She wanted compensation for the Clegg family. Wanted something on the record about what had happened to Hazel. And my parents fought her. Yes, it was settled out of court. Money and property changed hands. Everyone agreed to silence. Lillian returned to the couch and picked up the journal pages Agnes had copied. She read through them slowly, carefully, and Agnes watched her face as she absorbed her grandmother's words. The pain, the guilt, the impossible choice between justice and mercy. She was protecting me, Lillian said finally. Helen, your grandmother. She could have exposed everything, but she chose not to because she thought it would hurt me. She thought you'd built a life that didn't need to be destroyed by the truth. She thought maybe mercy was more important than justice. Was she right? Lillian looked at Agnes directly. Knowing what you know about me now after sitting here in my home, seeing my life, do you think she was right to stay silent? Agnes had been dreading this question. I don't know. I think she made the choice she thought was most kind. But I also think Hazel deserved to be remembered. And I think you deserve to know that you were wanted, that your mother loved you, that she died grieving for you. Lillian was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I built my identity on being unwanted. I told myself my birth mother didn't want the burden of a child, that she'd made a practical choice to give me to people who could provide better. I made peace with being given away. Her voice broke slightly. Now you're telling me I was stolen, that my mother wanted me, that she died heartbroken. How do I reconcile that with the life I've lived? With the gratitude I felt toward my parents? With the peace I made with being adopted? I don't know. I'm sorry. Maybe I shouldn't have come. Maybe my grandmother was right and this should have stayed buried. No. Lillian's voice was firm. No, you did the right thing. I spent 30 years believing a lie about who I am. The truth is harder, but it's mine. Hazel is mine. Her story is mine. She picked up the locket again. This was meant for me. Finally, I have it. She stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulled out a photo album, and brought it back. She opened it to a page showing family portraits. Herself, her husband, her children. This is my daughter, Rachel. She's 45, and this is her daughter, Sophie. She's 20. Lillian turned the album so Agnes could see. Tell me you don't see Hazel in them. Agnes looked at the photographs and felt her chest tighten. There it was. The same dark eyes, the same direct gaze, the same subtle strength in the set of the jaw. Hazel's features, carried forward through 3 generations, undeniable. They looked like her. Like you, I always wondered where I got these features. My adoptive parents were fair, light-eyed. People would comment on how different I looked. I told myself genetics were random, that it didn't matter. Lillian's fingers traced the photograph of her granddaughter. But it does matter. This is Hazel's legacy. She's not forgotten. She's here in my face, in my daughter's face, in my granddaughter's face. She closed the album and looked at Agnes with new resolve. I want to know everything. I want to see all the documents. I want to visit Hazel's grave. I assume there is one? Yes, a simple marker. No family name listed. Then we'll change that. We'll put her name properly on it. We'll acknowledge her as my mother." Lillian's voice grew stronger. "I can't undo what was done to her. I can't bring her back or give her the life she should have had with me. But I can make sure she's remembered. I can make sure her story isn't erased anymore." Agnes felt something loosen in her chest. This was the answer. Not mercy through silence, but mercy through remembrance. Not justice through punishment, but justice through acknowledgement. "There's something else you should know," Agnes said quietly. "The house you're living in, this property, it was part of the original Roury holdings. It passed to the Clegg family in the settlement, then apparently to the Pritchards later. This land should have been part of Hazel's inheritance." Lillian looked around her living room, seeing it with new eyes. "So I'm living on my mother's land? The land she should have passed to me herself?" "Yes, that's—" Lillian laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "That's almost too much irony to bear. I've been living my whole life on land that should have been mine anyway." Through her, never knowing, she stood and walked through her house, touching the walls, looking at the familiar spaces, as if seeing them for the first time. Agnes followed her. "This changes everything," Lillian said finally. "My understanding of who I am, where I came from, what I owe, and to whom. It doesn't erase the good my adoptive parents gave me, but it adds a layer of complication I can't ignore. I'm sorry. Don't be. You gave me the truth. You gave me Hazel. That's a gift, even if it's a painful one." Lillian turned back to Agnes. "Will you help me? Will you help me uncover the rest of the story, document it properly, make sure Hazel gets the recognition she deserved?" "Yes, that's why my grandmother kept these documents. That's why she couldn't destroy them. She wanted someone to finish what she started, then we'll finish it together. For Hazel, for Helen, for all the women whose stories get buried because they're inconvenient or embarrassing or complicated." Lillian's expression was determined now, the tears gone, replaced by purpose. "We'll make sure this story doesn't die with our generation." Agnes felt her grandmother's presence in that moment, as clearly as if Helen had been standing in the room. This was what she'd wanted. Not revenge, not punishment, but remembrance. Not to destroy the life Lillian had built, but to acknowledge the life Hazel had lost. And now, 50 years later, two women who'd never met were going to do what their grandmothers couldn't, bring the truth into the light. Gently but firmly, and let the dead finally rest in acknowledgement, Agnes stayed at Lillian's house until evening, the two of them going through every document, every photograph, every letter. They built a timeline together, piecing together the story from fragments and implications. Lillian took notes, asked questions, and occasionally had to stop when emotion overwhelmed her. "I need time to process this," she said finally, as the light outside faded to dusk. "But I don't want to wait too long. The people who did this, my parents, the Cleggs who cooperated, the lawyers who rushed the adoption, they're all gone now. But their descendants are still here. I want them to know what happened. Not to shame them necessarily, but to acknowledge it." "That might cause complications," Agnes warned. "People don't like having their family histories challenged. The Cleggs especially. Amos already seems to carry a lot of guilt about this. He should. They all should." Lillian's voice was firm. "But you're right that it needs to be handled carefully. I'm thinking we document everything properly, work with the Historical Society to create an official record. Make it part of the Valley's history, not just whispered gossip." Over the next 2 weeks, they worked together almost daily. Agnes drove down from her mountain cabin, bringing more artifacts each time. Lillian contacted the Historical Society and began the process of documenting Hazel's story. They visited the county clerk's office again, this time together, and requested copies of every document related to the adoption and the subsequent lawsuit. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the story became. They discovered that Hazel's father had been in debt to the Pritchards, that there had been pressure on the family to cooperate with the adoption. They found medical records that had been used to declare Hazel emotionally unstable when she'd resisted, records signed by a doctor who'd been on the Pritchard family payroll. "They didn't just take her baby," Lillian said, staring at the documents. "They destroyed her credibility, made sure no one would believe her if she fought back. They used their power systematically to ensure she had no recourse. Agnes watched Lillian's face harden with each new discovery. The initial grief had transformed into something steelier. Determination to ensure this abuse of power was documented and acknowledged. They also found something Agnes hadn't expected, evidence that her grandmother hadn't been the only one fighting for Hazel. There had been a lawyer from Boise, a woman named Margaret Thorne, who'd taken Hazel's case pro bono in 1952, trying to reverse the adoption. She'd filed motions, demanded hearings, argued that the adoption had been coerced. But she'd been shut down by judges who were friends with the Pritchards, by legal maneuvers that had dragged on until Hazel's death made them moot. Your grandmother tried again 20 years later with her lawsuit, Lillian said. She was finishing what this Margaret Thorne started. She was trying to get justice when Hazel couldn't. Agnes felt a surge of pride in her grandmother, mixed with sadness for the burden she'd carried. She fought as hard as she could. But the power imbalance was too great. It always is. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. They decided to visit Hazel's grave together before taking any public action. It felt important to pay respects, to stand at the place where Hazel had been buried with minimal ceremony and maximum desire to forget. The cemetery was outside the valley town, up a hillside with views of the mountains. It was old, with markers dating back to the 1890s, and it had the peaceful, well-kept appearance of a place the community took seriously. They found Hazel's grave in a far corner, away from the family plots where the prominent citizens were buried. The marker was small, simple granite with just her name and dates. Hazel Marie Clegg, 1927-1952, 25 years old. An entire life compressed into 2 dates. Lillian knelt beside the grave, one hand flat against the cold stone. Agnes stood back, giving her space. The October wind rustled through the remaining leaves on the trees, and somewhere a crow called. "I'm sorry," Lillian said quietly. "I'm sorry you suffered. I'm sorry they took me from you. I'm sorry you died without knowing I would be okay, that I would have children and grandchildren, that your legacy would continue even though they tried to erase it." She set the locket on the grave marker. "I brought this. It was meant for me, and now I've received it. Thank you for wanting me. Thank you for fighting for me, even though you lost. I wish I could have known you." Agnes felt tears on her own face. This was what her grandmother had wanted, not legal victory, but this moment of connection across generations, this acknowledgement of love and loss. Lillian stood and turned to Agnes. "I want to put a proper marker here, one that says she was my mother, one that tells anyone who reads it that she was loved, that she mattered, that she's remembered. We'll do it. We'll commission it together." They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing logistics. Lillian would work with a monument company to design a new marker. They would hold a small dedication ceremony, invite family members from both sides, Cleggs, Rourys, Pritchards, give everyone a chance to acknowledge what had happened and make whatever peace they could. "Some people won't come," Lillian predicted. "Some will be angry that we're bringing this up. But we're doing it anyway," Agnes agreed. But she also knew this would cause ripples, possibly waves. Amos Clegg would have to face his family's complicity directly. Any living Pritchards would have to confront what their parents had done. The Valley community would have to reckon with a story they'd preferred to forget. Agnes made one more trip to see Amos, driving out to the Clegg property on a cold morning when frost coated everything. She found him splitting wood behind his house, the axe rising and falling with mechanical precision. He saw her truck and stopped, leaning on the axe handle. He didn't look surprised. "You found it all, didn't you? It wasn't a question." Agnes climbed out and approached carefully. "I found the letters, the documents, the photographs. I found out about Hazel and Lillian." "Figured you." "It would. That's why Grandpa told me to give it to a Roury. He spat in the dirt. Couldn't do it himself. Couldn't stand up to his own family. So he made it my burden." He must have felt guilty about what happened. Guilty? Maybe. Or just tired of carrying it. Either way, he dumped it on me, and I dumped it on you. Now what? Agnes told him about Lillian, about the new grave marker. about the plans to document the story officially. Amos listened without expression. So everyone's going to know. Going to know my family took money to give up a baby. Going to know we let the Pritchards bully Hazel into signing papers. Going to know my grandfather took payment in the settlement to keep quiet about it all. Yes, he nodded slowly. Good, about time someone said it out loud. I've been carrying this since my grandfather told me the story on his deathbed. Made me promise to make it right somehow, but never told me how. Now you've done it for me. It wasn't just for you, I know. But I'm grateful anyway. He picked up the axe again. I'll come to your ceremony. I'll stand there and acknowledge it. Won't make it right, but it's something. Agnes left feeling like a piece had fallen into place. The Cleggs wouldn't fight this. Amos, at least, wanted the truth known as much as they did. The real complication came when Lillian tried to contact her cousins, the children and grandchildren of other Pritchards. Most didn't respond. One sent back an angry letter saying Lillian was betraying the family that had raised her, that she was being manipulated by that mountain woman with an agenda. Lillian called Agnes after receiving the letter, her voice tight with anger and hurt. They don't want to hear it. They think I'm being ungrateful, that I'm inventing problems to justify some psychological need. Are you surprised? No, but I'd hoped for better, she sighed. We're going forward anyway. We don't need their permission to tell the truth. The monument company finished the new marker 3 weeks after their first visit to the grave. It was larger than the original black granite with gold lettering. It read, Hazel Marie Clegg, 1927-1952, beloved mother of Lillian, for my daughter who deserved better. Beneath that, in smaller text, her story was silenced but not forgotten. She is remembered with love. They scheduled the dedication for a Saturday in early November. Lillian sent invitations to everyone connected to the story, all surviving Cleggs, Pritchards, Rourys, and the broader Valley community. She posted a notice in the local newspaper explaining what they were doing and why. The response was mixed. Some people expressed support. Others sent letters saying they were dredging up old pain for no good reason. The Historical Society Board had a split vote, but ultimately approved documenting Hazel's story as part of the Valley's historical record. Agnes spent the days before the ceremony at her cabin, writing and rewriting the remarks she would give. She wanted to honor her grandmother, to explain why this mattered, to make clear this wasn't about punishment, but about acknowledgement. The night before the ceremony, she walked the mountain trails in darkness, guided by starlight and intimate knowledge of the terrain. She thought about her grandmother walking these same mountains decades ago, carrying the weight of Hazel's story, trying to decide what justice looked like when the powerful had already won. She thought about Hazel, 25 years old and heartbroken, dying without knowing her daughter would be okay. She thought about Lillian, building a life on a foundation she believed was solid, then discovering it was built on someone else's grief. And she thought about herself, a woman who'd chosen isolation to escape complications, only to be pulled back into the messiest kind of human entanglement. But she didn't regret it. This mattered. Truth mattered. Memory mattered. When she returned to her cabin as dawn broke, she was ready. Tomorrow they would stand at Hazel's grave and say her name, claim her story, ensure she was remembered. Whatever response came, whatever complications followed, it would be worth it. Some silences needed to be broken. Some truths needed to be spoken. And some women, long forgotten, needed to finally be brought home. The cemetery parking lot was more crowded than Agnes expected. She arrived early, 30 minutes before the scheduled dedication, and already there were 24 cars. People stood in small clusters, talking quietly, some looking uncomfortable, others curious. Agnes parked and walked up the hillside to where the new marker had been installed. A cloth covered it, waiting for the formal unveiling. Lillian was already there with her family, her 3 children, their spouses, 7 grandchildren ranging from teenagers to young adults. They'd brought flowers, and the youngest granddaughter held the silver locket, which they planned to bury near the grave marker as a final gift to Hazel. I wasn't sure anyone would come, Lillian said when Agnes reached her. People are curious, and some of them want to witness this. More people arrived. Agnes recognized Gideon from the general store, several members of the Historical Society, some older residents who would have been alive when the lawsuit happened. And then Amos Clegg appeared, walking slowly up the hill alone. He nodded to Agnes and Lillian but kept his distance, standing apart from the other groups. A minister from Lillian's church arrived. She'd asked him to say a few words, to make this feel like the funeral Hazel never really had. He was a kind-faced man in his 60s who'd listened to the whole story and agreed immediately to participate. At 10 o'clock, Lillian stepped forward. The crowd quieted, and Agnes counted maybe 50 people total. A respectable showing for a woman who'd been dead 70 years and deliberately forgotten. "Thank you all for coming," Lillian began. Her voice was steady, clear. "We're here today to honor Hazel Marie Clegg, who died in 1952 at the age of 25. For 70 years, her story has been buried along with her. Today we're changing that." She spoke simply, directly about Hazel's life, her friendship with Helen Roury, her pregnancy and the pressure she faced, the forced adoption, her death. "Hazel was my mother," Lillian said. "I was taken from her when I was 2 weeks old. She died without knowing if I would be okay, without seeing me grow up, without holding me again. The people who orchestrated this believed they were doing the right thing. They gave me a good life, opportunities, love. But they did it by breaking another woman's heart, by using their power to override her wishes, by silencing her voice." Agnes watched the crowd's reaction. Some people were crying quietly. Others looked uncomfortable. A few had their arms crossed, defensive. "I'm not here to condemn my adoptive parents," Lillian continued. "They're gone, and I believe they loved me in their way. But I am here to say that what was done to Hazel was wrong. It was an abuse of power. It was cruelty disguised as mercy, and it shouldn't be forgotten." She gestured to Agnes. "Agnes Roury, whose grandmother fought for Hazel and for me, has helped me uncover this story. She brought me the evidence that had been hidden, the letters and photographs and documents that proved Hazel existed, that she mattered, that she loved me. Agnes, would you share what you found?" Agnes stepped forward, her prepared remarks suddenly feeling inadequate. She pulled out the photograph of Hazel and Helen together, holding it up so people could see. "This is Hazel and my grandmother, Helen. They were best friends. When Hazel needed help, Helen tried to provide it. When Hazel died, Helen carried that grief for the rest of her life. And 20 years later, when Helen tried to force acknowledgement of what had happened, she was shut down by people with more power and resources." Agnes's voice grew stronger as she continued. "My grandmother kept these documents hidden but couldn't destroy them. She wanted someone to eventually find them, to tell this story. She chose mercy over justice in her lifetime because she didn't want to hurt Lillian. But she also believed Hazel deserved to be remembered." She looked directly at Amos. "The Clegg family carried guilt about this for generations. They finally gave me access to these materials because they wanted the truth known, even though it reflects poorly on their own family. That took courage." Amos's face didn't change, but he gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "We're here today to unveil a new marker that names Hazel properly, that acknowledges her as Lillian's mother, that ensures anyone who visits this cemetery will know she existed and mattered." Agnes paused. "This isn't about revenge or punishment. Everyone directly responsible is long dead. This is about memory, about refusing to let inconvenient truths be buried forever, about saying that every person's story matters, even when they have no power to defend it." The minister stepped forward and said a prayer, simple words about healing, forgiveness, and the importance of truth. Then Lillian and her oldest daughter pulled away the cloth covering the new marker. The black granite gleamed in the November sunlight. Hazel's name, her date, the inscription about her daughter, the words about being remembered with love. It was permanent, substantial, impossible to ignore. Lillian knelt and placed the locket in a small hole they dug at the base of the marker, then covered it with earth. Her granddaughter set flowers on top, white roses fresh and beautiful against the dark stone. Agnes felt something shift in the air, as if a weight had lifted. The ceremony was reaching its culmination, and she knew the hardest part was still coming. The community's response, the conversations that would follow, the reckoning with a history people had preferred to forget. After the formal dedication, people began to approach the marker, reading the inscription, some touching the stone gently. Agnes watched Lillian's family gather around her, her children, her grandchildren, all studying the name of the woman whose genes they carried, whose story they'd never known. An older woman Agnes didn't recognize approached Lillian. She was maybe 80, moving slowly with a cane, but her eyes were sharp. "I knew Hazel," she said. "Just a little. I was young when she died, but I remember her at the library, remember her being kind to children. Nobody talked about what happened to her, but we all knew something sad had occurred. Thank you for telling me," Lillian said, and Agnes heard the hunger in her voice. This was what she needed, not just documents and photographs, but living memory. People who'd known Hazel as a person, not just a tragedy. "She had a beautiful laugh," the woman continued. "I remember that, and she was gentle with a grace that impressed me even as a child." She touched Lillian's hand. "You look like her." "You have her eyes." Lillian's composure finally cracked. She embraced the woman, tears flowing freely now, and Agnes had to look away from the intimacy of the moment. Amos approached Agnes, his expression still guarded, but less hostile than usual. "My grandfather made me promise to make this right. I didn't know how." "You did. We all did it. You, me, Lillian, my grandmother before us. It took all of us. Still, I'm grateful. Maybe now the old man can rest." He paused. "And maybe I can too. Carrying someone else's guilt is a heavy thing. You can set it down now." He nodded and walked away, but with lighter steps than Agnes had ever seen him use. Not everyone was supportive. A woman about Lillian's age, who Agnes learned was a distant Pritchard cousin, approached with obvious anger. "You're doing this for attention," she said to Lillian, "making yourself the center of some dramatic story. Your parents gave you everything, and this is how you repay them, by dragging their names through the mud." Lillian faced her calmly. "I'm telling the truth. That's not dragging anyone through anything. It's simply stating what happened. It was 70 years ago. Let the dead rest. The dead can't rest when their stories are lies." Lillian's voice was firm. "Hazel deserves to be remembered honestly, and I deserve to know where I came from honestly. If that makes you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. But I'm not going to stay silent to protect people who are already gone." The woman walked away stiffly, and Agnes saw similar reactions from a few others. People who clearly felt this was unnecessary, provocative, damaging to reputations that should be left intact. But they were outnumbered by people who seemed moved by the ceremony, who came forward to thank Lillian for her courage, who told their own stories of family secrets and buried truths. The minister approached Agnes. "This was important work," he said. "Bearing witness to past wrongs, even when we can't undo them, is part of healing, both for individuals and communities. I hope so. Some people seem to think we should have left it buried. There's always resistance to truth when it challenges comfortable narratives. But you gave Hazel her voice back. That matters." As the crowd began to disperse, Lillian gathered her family around the grave. They stood in a circle, and her oldest son spoke. "I wish I could have known her, my grandmother, the one whose blood I carry. But I'm grateful to know her story now, to understand where part of me came from." His daughter Sophie, the one who looked so much like Hazel, knelt and touched the marker. "I have her face. I see it in photographs now. It's like meeting a relative I never knew existed." Lillian looked at Agnes across the circle. In that look was gratitude, grief, relief, and something like peace. They had done what needed doing. They had pulled Hazel from obscurity, given her back her daughter, her family, her place in the story. The sun was setting by the time the last people left. Agnes and Lillian stood alone at the grave, the flowers bright against the darkening grass. "What happens now?" Lillian asked. "Now we live with what we've learned. We honor it. We pass it forward. The Historical Society is going to create a permanent exhibit about Hazel, about forced adoptions, about how communities silenced women who didn't fit acceptable narratives. They want to use this as a teaching example. Your grandmother would be proud, so would yours. Lillian turned to Agnes. Thank you for bringing this to me, for not deciding I was better off not knowing, for trusting me with the truth. You deserved it. Hazel deserved it. They walked down the hillside together as darkness gathered. Behind them, the new marker stood solid and permanent, a testament to a woman who'd been forgotten but was forgotten no longer. Hazel Marie Clegg had her voice back. Her daughter had claimed her. Her story had been told, and though it couldn't change the past, it changed the future. For Lillian, for her family, for everyone who would read that marker and know that truth, however late, still mattered. Agnes returned to her mountain cabin on a Sunday evening, driving through darkness with the satisfaction of completion settling in her chest. The journey had been longer than she'd expected, more complicated, more emotionally demanding. But it had been necessary. She parked and sat for a moment looking at her cabin, the home she'd built with her own hands, the refuge she'd created from the world. It looked different now, though nothing physical had changed. It was still isolated, still simple, still hers alone. But the isolation felt less like escape and more like choice. And that was a subtle but profound shift. Inside, she lit the lamps and built a fire, familiar rituals that grounded her. She made coffee and sat in her chair, looking at the remaining artifacts she'd brought back from the shed. Most were now with Lillian or the Historical Society, but she'd kept a few things. The ledger that had first caught her attention, one photograph of her grandmother and Hazel together, and a copy of her grandmother's final journal entry. She read that entry again by lamplight, her grandmother's words resonating differently now that the task was complete. If Lillian is meant to know, she'll know. If not, perhaps that's the kinder outcome. Lillian had been meant to know. And it had been kind despite the pain. Agnes was certain of that now. 3 months passed. Winter came to the mountains with the usual severity. Deep snow, bitter cold, days when Agnes didn't see another human being. But she made trips down to the valley more frequently now, visiting Lillian, working with the Historical Society on their exhibit, maintaining the connection she'd formed. The exhibit opened in February, a small but well-documented display about forced adoptions in the mid-20th century, using Hazel's story as the central example. It included photographs, copies of documents, and testimony from people who'd known her. Lillian had written a personal reflection about discovering her origins, honest about both the pain and the gift of finally knowing the truth. The response was stronger than anyone expected. Other families came forward with their own stories of hushed adoptions, coerced signatures, women pressured to give up children. The Historical Society began collecting these stories, building a more complete picture of how power and shame had shaped their community's history. Not everyone approved. There were letters to the newspaper arguing this was airing dirty laundry, that it served no purpose to dredge up old pain. But more people seemed to feel it was overdue, a reckoning with a past that had been sanitized and simplified into comfortable myths. Agnes and Lillian had become friends, an unexpected development that pleased them both. They met regularly, sometimes at Lillian's house in the valley, sometimes at Agnes's cabin in the mountains. They talked about their grandmothers, about family histories, about the complicated legacy of women who tried to do right, but often had to choose between bad options. "I'm working on something," Lillian told Agnes one afternoon in March, as they sat on Agnes's porch, watching early spring arrive in the high country. "A book, about Hazel, about Helen, about all of this. I want to document it properly, so the story doesn't get lost again." "That's good." "That's exactly right. Will you help me? You know things I don't. You have your grandmother's perspective." "I'll help however I can." They worked on the book together over the next year, meeting weekly, trading drafts, arguing over details, pushing each other toward honesty. It was hard work, emotionally exhausting at times, but also deeply satisfying. They were building something permanent, something that would outlast them both. The book was published by a small regional press the following autumn. It didn't become a bestseller, but it sold steadily, mostly to people in the valley and surrounding areas. More importantly, it became part of the local historical record, assigned in high school history classes, referenced in academic papers about adoption history and women's rights. Agnes was 59 now, still living alone in her mountain cabin, still walking the trails and reading the weather and maintaining her chosen solitude. But it was a different kind of solitude than before. Not isolation from the world, but engagement with it on her own terms. She'd learned something through this journey, that you could be alone without being disconnected, that you could maintain boundaries without building walls, that peace sometimes required action rather than withdrawal. She thought often about her grandmother, wishing she could tell her how it had ended. Helen would have been pleased, Agnes thought. Pleased that Hazel was remembered, pleased that Lillian knew the truth, pleased that the silence had finally been broken. Not the outcome Helen had fought for in court, but perhaps better, acknowledgement without punishment, truth without revenge. One evening, as Agnes sat at her window watching stars emerge over the ridge, she realized she'd become what her grandmother had been, a keeper of stories, a bridge between past and present, someone who understood that silence could be both mercy and cruelty, depending on what it protected. The forest stretched out in darkness around her cabin, holding its own secrets, its own histories. She'd learned to respect that. Some things should stay buried, not out of shame, but because they'd served their purpose and could rest. But other things needed to surface, needed to be spoken, needed to be remembered. Agnes had spent 20 years learning when to speak and when to stay silent. This time, speaking had been the right choice. And now, having spoken, having broken the silence that had lasted 70 years, she could return to her own quiet with a clear conscience. The mountain night settled around her cabin. Inside, the fire burned low. The artifacts that had started this journey were distributed now, with Lillian, with the Historical Society, with Amos, who'd finally given them up. Agnes kept only a few photographs and her grandmother's journal, reminders of where she'd come from and what she'd learned. Some things weren't meant to stay buried. Sometimes the past found you, and when it did, you had a choice, to turn away or to face it honestly. Agnes had faced it. She'd honored her grandmother's unfinished work. She'd given Hazel back her daughter, and her daughter back her mother, and now, in the deep silence of the Idaho wilderness, Agnes could finally rest.